In this video, I'm going to do number 6B on page 127 of Krugman and Wells Microeconomics. And in that problem, we are told that the willingness to pay for each consumer drops by $20, and the problem asks us to recalculate producer and consumer demand surplus after this drop. So I'm going to do the consumer surplus in this video. So if the willingness to pay for each consumer drops by $20, then I need to come over to the table and redo these prices here. So in the first row, I have that 50 individuals were, prior to the drop, willing to pay $55 per book. And so now, if that drops by $20, now I have that they are only willing to pay $35. The 35 individuals who were willing to pay $60 are now only willing to pay $40. The 25 individuals willing to pay $65 are only willing to now pay $45, and so on. So I've gone ahead and filled out the rest of that information. So even though I am working on consumer surplus in this problem, I am asked to consider consumer surplus at the equilibrium price. And so it's important for me to now consider where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. But before I do that, I really need to rethink my suppliers. Because just because the willingness to pay for the books dropped does not mean that the willingness to sell also dropped. So these sellers now, even if the willingness to pay for consumers dropped by $20, these suppliers still have, as far as the problem is concerned, still have the same willingness to sell. And so I need to rethink the right-hand column. And the reason I'm going to do it, even though I'm only calculating consumer surplus, is because I need to know where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied after this price drop. So let's take the first row. We have that 0 suppliers were willing to supply at the price of $55. That was before the drop. So it would make sense to think that if these people, if the lowest that these sellers were willing to take for their books was $55, then they're certainly not going to take $35. So I'm just going to cross out this 0 just so that we know that we've thought about this and we're sticking with 0. Then let's move down a row. We have that one seller was willing to sell at $60. That was the lowest they were willing to take for their book. So if that was the lowest, then they're certainly not going to sell their book at $40. So again, we have no sellers for a new price of $40. And that's really going to continue. I mean, if you look, the first seller that we see show up to the market, the lowest they're willing to take for their book is $60. So until we get to $60, we are not going to have any sellers. So this is just going to be 0 until we get to the point where we are selling for $60. Once we're selling for $60, now all of a sudden we have one seller. And now we can say, okay, now moving down one more row, we say now we have a new willingness to pay of $65. Well, how many sellers did we have when the willingness to pay was $65? And we had 3. That's where I'm getting that from there. So I'm going to put down 3. Moving to the to 70. To the price of 70, well, I can say to myself, well, I'm no longer going to have 18 who were the least they were willing to take was 90, selling 70. So 18 is getting crossed out. But if I look at my prior prices, I had 3 sellers who were willing to take, the lowest they were willing to take was 70. And so I'll just put that 70 here. And so essentially what's going to happen is all the numbers I had down the line before are just going to get transferred over. So I have 1, 3, 3, 6, 9, 10, and 18. And so I'm just going to cross the rest of these numbers out. Okay, so now I can think about trying to consider where my equilibrium is. Again, my equilibrium, just for good measure, I'm going to write this down, is where my quantity demanded is equal to, let me put a colon here, is equal to quantity supplied. So I need to compare my second and third columns to see where the two numbers are equal. And that is going to happen at the price of $75. So at the price of $75, I have six consumers willing to pay $75 and 6 sellers willing to sell at $75. So now that I have the price, I have this equilibrium price of $75, I can now ignore my quantity supplied for right now. Okay. Now let's consider a graph. I'm going to do this graphically like I'd done part 6a. I'm going to do it graphically first so that I can link up the graph with the algebra that we do later. Okay, so I have my axes set up, and now I'm going to go ahead and plot the information that I have. Like I did in part A, I am going to start, when I do quantity demanded, I'm going to start with the bottom of the table. It just seems more straightforward to think about it as going from least to most with quantity demanded. So at the price of $90 per book, we have no one demanding the book. And so I'm going to represent that with just that dot there at 0.90. Then at $85 per book, I have 2 consumers demanding the book. So I'm just going to represent that now with a bar. I'm going to use this bar method. Okay. And then I have, at the price of $80 per book, I have 4 individuals demanding the book. So at $80, I have 4. Okay. Then at $75, I have 6 individuals demanding books. So 75, 6. And I'm just going to continue in that way until I've represented all the information in the table. Okay, so I've gone ahead and just plotted all the information. I've put a dot in the right corner of every bar just to signify that that would be the point that you would plot if you were just, plotting this as coordinates. So 0.90 to 85, working from the bottom row upwards. And, we have this this trend that conforms to our understanding of the law of demand, that as the price drops of a good, we see more and more demand for it. And if we were to connect these dots, we would see the familiar figure of the downward sloping demand curve. Okay, so now I want to consider the question of, okay, at the equilibrium price, how would I, what do I have for consumer surplus? So the equilibrium price is $75. So I'm going to just, as I have been doing, just put a bar across where the price is. And that's there at that purple line there. And then my consumer surplus is going to be the area of the bars, the area of the portion of the bar that reaches above that line. Okay, so it's going to be that area there. It's going to be this area here, and that's it. So I now need to calculate the area of these two shaded portions. With the first portion, I have that it spans a width of 2. That's, let me put that here. So that's 2. And then a height of 10. So I have that the area of that shaded portion there is 20. Why are you not writing 20? Okay. The second one looks like it spans 2 as well. So this is again 2. And the height is 5, so I have an area of 10. And then, notice with the third bar there, I've made a sale, but there's no consumer a consumer has purchased the item, but there's no consumer surplus because the consumer who purchased at that price of $75, that was actually the most that they were willing to pay, and so there was no surplus generated. So now to get the total surplus that is generated in this market, total consumer surplus that's generated in this market, after the willingness to pay has dropped by $20, I would just add these two numbers, 20 plus 10, to get 30. That is the total consumer surplus generated after a drop in the willingness to pay of $20. Okay, so I've just shrunk that graph a bit because I'm going to use it to illustrate, how we would do this algebraically. Like I did in the last problem, I'm going to consider, how many more consumers come to the market, as the price drops of the book. That essentially gives us, in terms of our graph, it gives us the width of each one of our rectangles. But, it's just to generate the idea that it's not that we have, 50 more consumers coming into the market when the price of a book drops from $40 to $35. 50 represents the total. And so if we want to understand, how much more consumer surplus is generated for each drop in the price, then we need to understand how many more consumers come to the market. And so what I'm going to do is go over to this table and cross out, just really faintly, I'm going to cross out the numbers and just put aside it, how many more have come to the market, not the total. So when the price of the book was $90, no one was coming into the market to buy them. When it dropped to $85, 2 buyers came into the market to buy books. Then when the price dropped to $80, then we had, this is the first time I'm going to cross it out, we had, let me put this in black, we had 2 more come into the market. Then when the price dropped to $75, again, we had 2 more come into the market. So we went from 4 to 6. Then again, 2 more when the price dropped to $70. We had 2 more come in when the price dropped to $65. 2 more when the price dropped to $60. 2 more when the price dropped to $55. 3 more when the price dropped to $50. 8 more when the price dropped to $45. 10 more when the price dropped to $40. And then 15 more when the price dropped to $35. So that's going to allow us to now calculate the consumer surplus. Okay, so I've moved things around a bit just to give us some room to work, and I've created 2 new columns, one for the actual price sold and then the consumer surplus. Now remember, the consumer surplus is the willingness to pay, the highest price that consumer is willing to pay, minus the actual price paid. Now, this problem has told us to assume that the equilibrium price is the binding price here. It's the price at which books are sold. So down the line here, I'm just going to enter 75 as the actual price that the book is sold at. And now I'm going to consider the consumer surplus. So notice that, up until we get to a willingness to pay of 75, we are not going to have any buyers. So that's going to generate no consumer surplus until we get to the point where we get to 75, and then the consumer surplus is going to be 0. Why? Well, once we get to 75, the willingness to pay is 75, and the actual price that's paid is 75. So 75 minus 75 is going to be 0. So I'm just going to write that there. Now, where do we see all this on the graph that we made before? Well, we see the fact that there is no consumer surplus generated from this entire area moving from the right to the left, below the line. Whoop, no surplus. Okay. And then once we hit 75, the top of the bar is just at the price line. So that's where, we have no consumer surplus generated. Then at $80, now we have an actual calculation. We have two consumers who were, willing to pay $80 for this book, and they actually got it for $75. So for each one of them, they spent $5 less than they were willing to pay for the book. So each one of them generated a consumer surplus. The market generated a consumer surplus of 5, and there were two of them. So we have a consumer surplus here of 10. So I'm just going to put in parentheses that this is 5 generated for each individual times 2 individuals. And that 2 I'm getting from the fact that 2 more had entered the market to purchase at $80. They had their willingness to pay for the book at $80. And that corresponds, that 10 there corresponds with the first area that I had calculated for the shaded portion of the bar, there where I drew that arrow. Now, I just want to say, because I just thought of it, that I want to just remind you once in a while that this framework assumes, so what we've assumed, everybody has the ability to pay. Okay? That's a very crucial assumption for this framework. Everybody's walking in the market with enough money to buy the things that they want. And so the only thing determining, whether or not somebody actually buys something is how much they want it, because they have the money for it. So I just want to remind you of that once in a while. It's a very crucial assumption. Okay, back to our calculations. Now we have, moving down to the next row, we have two consumers who are willing to purchase at the price of $85. And they were actually, in fact, able to buy the book for $75. So for each one of them, the market produced a consumer surplus of $10, but there were two. And so the total consumer surplus generated at $85 was $20. And in parentheses, I'll just put, $10 for each one and 2 individuals. Then moving on to $90, well, we would have had a consumer surplus generated if someone was willing to buy at $90, but we actually have the quantity of books demanded is 0. And so we have no consumer surplus generated here because no one actually bought the book. You can't generate a surplus if no one purchases. And that is demonstrated graphically at the point 0.90, so this point right there. Okay, so in order to get our total consumer surplus, we would have to add all of these numbers up. So the only ones we really need to add up are 10 and 20, which gives us a total consumer surplus of 30, and that is in fact what we got by doing this graphically.